Thank you. This is my first time presenting at NACIS, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Alex for moderating. Thank you to my voice for mostly holding out through at least the next few minutes, hopefully. And to begin with, I want to respectfully acknowledge the Puyallup, the Puget Sound Salish, who have stewarded this land. Especially at a conference where we are all working on understanding how to communicate information about physical space in a thoughtful way, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. This is my first time doing one, and I hope to learn how to do this better. I appreciate nativelands.ca, which I encourage everyone to look at if they haven't, and to the US Department of Arts and Culture, which is a grassroots action network, from which I did some research about how to put that together. And researching the land acknowledgement, I'm going on about a little bit because I had some of the same questions that came up while working on this project. Whose map is it? What's included? How do I figure out what isn't included? And so stepping back for a moment. Last year, I read a paper on something else entirely, an economics paper about railroads in the West, which used data about post offices opening and closing as a proxy for placeness, a way to hold up a mirror to check for breath. The author didn't dwell on his reasoning for doing this. It was sort of mentioned in passing before moving on. However, I was quite taken by this idea. I thought I was going to be using this presentation to talk about sources of data, to think about places over time, and what we could see from one set of data compared to another, but as it seems like happens to many people, I ended up with more questions than answers and thought more about the process than the outcome. And the question I want to start with is when does it make sense, or what that I did start with was sort of when does it make sense to use the post office instead of the census for looking at a place's existence? And this was supposed to be about data and knowledge, and it is, but very differently than I had expected. It's about all the choices that come before putting colors, or sometimes one color on a map. When I started working on this, I wanted to narrow it down a bit to start with one state. I chose Alaska partly because of another project I was doing, and also because of the scale, thinking about human communities somewhere in the 660,000 square miles. My overall takeaway is it's not the worst idea using the post office as a proxy for place. As a demonstration of why this can sometimes be a helpful approach, I want to consider what happened between the 1890 and 1900 census. Up until and including the 1900 census, Alaska was only divided into two parts. There weren't tracts, it was just a northern and southern district. And the Alaska Gold Rush began in the last years of the 19th century. So the changes between 1890 and 1900 were pretty significant, but hard to capture if you only have basically like half the state. In 1890, the northern district had about a quarter as many people as the southern district, and by 1900, they were pretty evenly matched, but that number doesn't tell you anything else about where those people lived. Looking at where post offices opened in those years, we get a little bit better sense of where people ended up. And these are from the United States Postal Service records, which are very incomplete, as they acknowledge, but it's just an easy, already digitized source of openings and closings that I used as sort of a first pass. Even in situations that are less extreme than going through a gold rush, waiting for the decennial census can be slow and mean quite some time before we see changes that we know are happening. With the postal data, while much of it isn't that clean, we have a specific day when the post office opened or closed rather than needing to wait another 10 years. While in recent years, there's the American Community Survey, it still isn't everywhere or for everything. And this is the census map, including land and sea otters, which might be of great importance to some people, but not necessarily tell us where people are living. Post office information can be more fine-grained in both time and place. by choosing Alaska, it's sort of the most extreme version of a lot of space and trying to figure out where people are within it, an edge case. So even in the current Tiger files, these are the census blocks in which at least one person was counted in 2010. So even the census shapes are not really that precise. Or they're precise, but they're not that fine-grained. If there's one person in that huge expanse, it doesn't really tell us where people are living. So, as I said at the beginning, this process left me with many more questions than answers. And one of the things is, how do we know that something is a place, sort of, or what is a community? Is it if it has a post office, if it has a school? This is the first time there was a line waiting at the Anchorage post office when it first opened in 1901. And these are some of the places that are in the list that the United States Postal Service has of post offices, but aren't in the places that Natural Earth includes, and thinking about the different ways that we have a set of data and sort of assume that that's complete enough. How do I know where there is or was a post office is also not entirely clear or a straightforward proposition. The United States Postal Service provides information about openings and closures and makes it clear that their information is wildly incomplete. A postal historian named Richard Hellbach has compiled a list of mostly all the post offices which have been in the United States, but it's in a 7-volume book, and which is not great for a digital project. And as Hellbach points out in the introduction, what counts as a post office is also pretty squishy. Sometimes the same place name could be used in several different physical spaces, miles or kilometers apart. And especially when post offices were coterminous and were also the dry goods store or the train depot or a tent in a mining camp, if that same name carries through to several different places as different people become postmaster, is that considered the same place? Or what happens when the post office comes through and decides there's some reason that all that names have to be standardized in a way? Does a place stay the same if its name has changed? And so things like that make, again, sort of knowing what is open and what is closed and what is a post office not entirely clear. Post offices have closed because the gold rush ended, because the road went through someplace else, because the airstrip moved to the other side of the river. And in Alaska, many of the towns which have post offices now, and which will show up on the 2020 census, may not show up on the 2030 census, because the land that the town is on now will be in the ocean. The reason that some of these towns exist where they are, and that these towns exist and exist where they are, is that the territorial government at some point built a school there. People who had traveled with the hunting seasons moved to a town and stayed, because otherwise the government would have sent their children away to boarding school if there wasn't a school to go to, and the government decided where the schools were. So sort of the territorial government willed these places into being, forced people to move there, and now they will slowly be taken away in winter storms. So showing these towns existing and going out of existence on a map is a front for so much else happening. So what would be left out if I stuck with this approach of, at some point, digitizing all of those records of post offices and using that as a complete picture of sort of when communities came into existence? And along with what would be left out, it's all of the things that are inadvertently included. So it's all of this history of places based on names, Kasselhoff and Petersburg for when this was Russian America, Kenai and Ketchikan for the Native Alaskans, Cordova and Valdez because of all the Spanish explorers who came through, Cold Port and False Pass, presumably named for somebody who was having a very bad day. However, the map wouldn't include the ways that the mail actually got around, which in Alaska was by dog sled and horse-drawn sleigh and by boat, along with planes and trains and automobiles. A map that was based on post offices would leave out how the post offices got there. Requesting a post office was an act of civic engagement. You could get together some friends or neighbors, petition your representative, and if you had one, and get a post office. However, who would be going to petition to have their town or mining camp or crossroads recognized? People who felt entitled enough to government services or government attention, who knew the procedures or felt comfortable asking what it was, people who wanted to be counted and noticed. Thank you. I like this idea of the post office as a mark of placehood because I'm super interested in the postal system in general. And in this sort of oblique mention of using it this way, somebody else had nodded to the importance of the post office. Whether it's from crowdsourced data or data.gov, we need to figure out what we're going to show. At the beginning of this project, I set out to make a map and instead thought about all the things the map would leave out. So to answer my framing question in as vague a way as possible, I think that using the post office as a way to validate a community's existence makes sense sometimes, along with an understanding of what is elided by doing so. Thank you.